Hello, Partner und Partnerinnen. A little German joke. Um, anyway, I know all of you are laughing at home. None of you laugh. Why did I become a teacher? God, you're all terrible. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Mr. Ansharsky. Welcome back to World History. This is part 2 of chapter 3, all about the ancient Mediterranean. And today we're going to look at Greece. We're going to look at what inspired Percy Jackson. But your bell work is on the screen, obviously. Compare religion in ancient Israel, Phoenicia, and Persia. All right. So yes, today is going to be the second part of our chapter 3. You only have to do one daily summary, and that lesson objective is at the start of the previous presentation. So today we're going to talk about Greece in a little bit of detail. But before that, I would normally say, talk to your neighbor. What do you already know about ancient Greece? But none of you are next to anybody right now. But obviously, it is something that is familiar with a lot of people. A lot of people are familiar with ancient Greece through works of popular culture, through obviously education. So Greece is something we are oftentimes familiar with. And as we're going to see actually throughout this course, the legacy of ancient Greece is going to be felt in European nations, especially, of course, in what we will talk about later with the Renaissance. So let's take a look at geography and how that's going to impact political and cultural developments in Greece. Well, Greece is terrible in terms of geography, in terms of terrain, in terms, I should say, of getting around to different places. Greece is filled with rocky mountains. It's filled, not the Rocky Mountains, of course. It's filled with rocky environments. It's extremely dry. There's not a lot of what we call navigable rivers. So as a result, communication between different communities in ancient Greece is going to be pretty restricted because of the difficult environment. However, beyond Greece, there is going to be a lot more communication thanks to the rich wealth of natural harbors in ancient Greece. And as a result, ancient Greek civilizations are going to be maritime civilizations. They are going to be sea-based civilizations. We are going to see the expansion of Greek culture through the creation of Greek colonies, which are often city-states, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So as a result of the terrible terrain in Greece, we are going to see kind of shifts in how Greece will adapt to its natural environment. For one thing, Greek agriculture is going to be mostly focused on things like barley and olives and grapes. I love Greek food. However, we're also going to see how this kind of dry environment is going to have different forms of architecture, different forms of art, different building materials. So there might not be a lot of trees in ancient Greece, other than, of course, those wonderful olive trees, but there is plenty of marble, there is plenty of stone, and that's going to have an artistic impact, as we'll talk about later. But we're also going to see the importance of sea trade. The Greeks are going to get in on this ancient Mediterranean sea trading community. Much like ancient Phoenicia, the Greeks are also going to build colonies around the Mediterranean. And oftentimes they're going to kind of interact with ancient Phoenician colonies, especially with places like Carthage. There's going to be Greek colonies in Sicily, Greek colonies all the way up to modern day Ukraine. I'm not going to make that joke. All right. Plus no one would laugh anyway. You guys are terrible. I dislike you all. That's not true. I'm being sarcastic. Anyway, so let's take a further look at how geography impacts political developments. Well, because of the terrible terrain, because of the difficult terrain, I should say, because of the lack of ease of communication beyond seafaring, there is going to be geographic isolation along the Greek peninsula. And as a result, political developments are mostly going to be centered around cities. So there are some rivers, of course, in ancient Greece. These are centers of agriculture, but cities are kind of far apart from each other. There is a bit of distance, and it's not all that easy to make a territorial kingdom in ancient Greece. So territorial kingdoms don't really happen for much of Greek history beyond the very beginning and the very end. In the very beginning, we have a group of civilizations known as the Minoans and the Myceneans. The Minoans and Myceneans, they're largely centered around these islands in southern Greece and on the island of Crete, also in Cyprus. And in the later period, as we'll talk about later, we will see eventually the creation of a huge empire that is ruled over by the Macedonian king, Alexander the Great, Alex the Great. So let's take a look at the city-state, because for much of Greek history, political developments are going to happen in these Greek city-states, also known as the polis or polis. So a city-state, as we all remember from our discussion of ancient Mesopotamia, a city-state is basically just a city and the surrounding farmland. It's very much limited to that small location. And as we all know with Phoenicia, as we remember with ancient Mesopotamia, these city-states are politically independent, and yet they all belong to Greek civilization because of their similar culture. They are culturally similar. They have similar kind of structures in terms of physical structures, in terms of city layout. They have similar religious ideas. They have similar ideas of hierarchy. Sometimes even they have similar political systems. And oftentimes the city layout is going to be the same in these Greek city-states. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is because it represents ideas of hierarchy. There are two big features typically found in any Greek city-state. One is the Acropolis, and the Acropolis is on a higher point in the city. It's the center of government. So there's a clear kind of distinction where government is, and buildings are going to reflect that. A lot of monuments, a lot of buildings that are important to society are going to be located on the Acropolis. The Acropolis is easy to defend. It's up higher in elevation. And as such, a lot of political life and a lot of religious life is going to be located on the Acropolis. But we also have the Agora. The Agora, that refers to the open area. That refers to where typically there are public ceremonies for religious festivals. This is also where the marketplace is. It's closer to the harbor, for example. But this kind of reflects the idea of class hierarchy. And let me explain. Because further inside the city, the downtown, you could say, further closer to the Acropolis, that's where all the big, important, rich people live. Whereas the commoners, the poorer people, they're either forced to live further away from the Acropolis or outside the city altogether. So the geography of the city-state is going to help reinforce class hierarchy in ancient Greece. But class hierarchy is also going to be expressed in how political systems will develop in ancient Greece. And there are typically three types of government we see across the different city-states. For one thing, we see monarchies. This is typically not a popular form of government because of how small these city-states are. These city-states are roughly about 10,000 people. That's not all that much, all things considered. In comparison, we do have cities in the Middle East and Mesopotamia with upwards of hundreds of thousands. So when you have a monarchy with one person ruling over a single place, that's going to be associated with this idea of tyranny, that there is an authoritarian government. And it's not going to be very popular among elites or commoners, because elites want to share power with people of similar backgrounds. So monarchy, not all that popular. Of course, there are monarchs, as we'll talk about with Alexander the Great, but it comes later. The typical two governments that we mostly see are going to be oligarchy and democracy, as we'll talk about. Well, let's first look at oligarchy. Well, oligarchy is a Greek word. Goes to show you the influence of Greece in modern day life. Oligarchy is a term that refers to rule by a select few, oftentimes ruled by an elite group of people based on wealth. So oligarchy is going to be something that does pop up. We do see kind of all government decisions being made in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. The wealthiest individuals in a Greek city-state, they're making all the rules for society. However, despite how unequal this system sounds, I want to put in a good word. Well, let's put in a counter argument for oligarchy, is that in a system that revolves so much on trade and material wealth, that if you are able to get into the merchant game, if you're able to get into this kind of system of making wealth, you could advance in society. You could become a part of this elite. You could be a part of government. And the only reason that I am introducing this defense, I don't think it's personally very fair, but the only reason I'm introducing this defense, and the lights just turned off, that's super wonderful. YMCA. All right, come on, there we go. And the only reason why I talk about this is that we're going to contrast it with democracy. And democracy is a term we throw around a lot today, but it has its origins in ancient Greece. The term democracy is a Greek word. It translates to rule by the people. And that seems pretty egalitarian on the face of it. It seems like a lot of people can participate in government. It doesn't matter what your background is. However, it's not ruled by most people, because the definition of who can participate in democracy is limited to citizens, people who live and have legal rights to live in a city-state. However, citizens don't comprise everybody, because only a small amount of people can be considered citizens. And actually, that's about 10 to 20% of these Greek city-state populations. Who is considered a citizen? Well, you have to be a man, as you can see in this image right here. You have to be a resident of the city, so no foreigners. But you also have to be a free person. You cannot be a slave. So we have a very restrictive form of government, even though more people can participate, not necessarily based on wealth. But even then, the people with the most money, they tend to be the ones who are elected the most. So there are systems of inequality in ancient Greece, as we'll talk about later. And that's represented in these political systems, kind of as the highlight of the two biggest city-states that historians often talk about. We're going to first look at Athens. Athens is one of the largest city-states that will pop up. It's arguably the most prominent for a lot of reasons. It is the wealthiest. Its population, in matters of population, it's the largest. But it's also going to be where a lot of cultural developments are occurring as a result of all of this wealth, mostly from sea trading, mostly from trade in the Mediterranean Sea. And as a result of all of this wealth, we are going to see works of art. We are going to see culture. That's famously expressed in monuments like the Parthenon. That's the major kind of temple to the city-state's goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. But speaking of wisdom, there are a lot of nerds in Athens as a result of all of this money being spent on monument and art making. So we are going to see the Athenian Academy. This is a place where we have philosophers. This is a place where we have historians. And I know you hate history, viewer, but this is something that is going to emerge from ancient Greece, at least in the Western tradition. We have the history of history going back as far as ancient Greece, going back as far as this Athenian Academy. But Athens is also notable because of its version of democracy. And much like that model I just talked about before, it's a very exclusive form of democracy. It's very much limited to a certain group of people, to men, to people who live in the city, and to free people. So we have an extremely hierarchical system of government that is based on a lot of statuses. It's based on, do you have freedom? It's based on your gender. It's based on whether or not you are a free person, whether or not you live within Athens. So Athenian democracy oftentimes is held up as kind of the birthplace of democracy. But as we are going to see throughout this course, oftentimes when people are saying they are in favor of democracy, it's only limited to a certain type of citizen. It's no surprise that groups like the revolutionaries of the 1700s and early 1800s, they could say that they were democratic, that they were following in the tradition of ancient Greece. But it turns out they were, because of how hierarchical and unequal these systems of democracy are. So let's turn our attention now to Athens' bitter rival, the city-state of Sparta. This, my friends, is Sparta in the image up here. I made a little 300 reference. You know what? I'm not funny. Why do I even try? God dang it. I almost swore, and that would have made this an inappropriate video, but it's not. We're talking about history. History is an interpretation. Well, Sparta is notable because of its system of politics, but also for its culture in general. Because Sparta is what we call a militaristic oligarchy. It is a culture that is absolutely dedicated to military training and to the defense of its city. And it's ruled over by a select few group of people. It is an oligarchy. However, as we're going to see, there are a lot of opportunities to break hierarchy. Well, for one thing, it goes back to this idea of if you have wealth, eventually maybe you could be a part of the oligarchy. How realistic is that? Well, that's another debate. But there's also going to be opportunities for women as well. And that's largely going to come through this militaristic culture. Because all men in Spartan society are trained for war. They are trained from birth to be a part of the Spartan military. They are trained to be what we call hoplites, Hoplite. So all men have this responsibility to be of service to the community as a whole. And that's going to leave a lot of wiggle room for women because men are oftentimes going to be outside the home. Women have a lot of responsibility within the home. They have a say of what goes on there. They have a say in how children are raised. But there's also this idea of kind of having separate groups of people, men always being with men all the time. That's going to lead to kind of fluid ideas of sexuality, not only for men, but women as well. So there is going to be severe discipline in this Spartan society. That's going to lead to a very basic and plain culture. If you ever hear the phrase Spartan or word Spartan, it often is referring to a kind of simple living, no luxuries. You are giving yourself to the state. You are giving yourself to the government of Sparta. But as a result of this militaristic focus, as a result of this kind of denial of luxury, we're not really going to see a lot of cultural developments, at least in the same way as Athens. So Sparta is going to be kind of isolated. It's going to be very much focused on its internal defense rather than having this kind of focus on spreading its culture, its philosophy. And as I said before, women have a much better place in Spartan society, arguably, because of these opportunities for say at what goes on at the home. They have the right to own property. They have the right to divorce their husbands. These are what we could consider female rights. But in this atmosphere of inequality, there are going to be systems of inequality throughout all of ancient Greece. There are exceptions, of course. We just looked at Sparta, but let's take a look at inequality in general. Well, for women, there's going to be an extreme form of patriarchy. Women are expected to cover their faces. Women are expected to basically not leave the house without a man or a slave. So there's an extremely patriarchal system in ancient Greece, for much of ancient Greece. Women, again, can't own property. They can't divorce. They can't leave the house, really. They can't be citizens. They can't participate in democracy. They can't go to the Athenian Academy. And this is a reflection of emerging ideas of philosophy. Because philosophers look out their window and they see what their society looks like, and they're questioning how and why, and whether or not that's a reflection of nature. And philosophers in ancient Greece, I'm just going to say it, they oftentimes are saying that these systems of inequality, since they've lasted for so long, they must be natural, including ideas of patriarchy. So there is this notion of separate spheres, and we'll come back to this topic a lot. It's the idea that women have a place within the home, whereas men have a place in the public sphere, in the public world. But as a result of kind of this distinction between men and women having their separate spaces, there's going to be a lot more fluid ideas of sexuality. Homosexuality is kind of permissible in ancient Greek society, not only for men, but for the women. For all you Star Wars fans, I'm not going to finish that quote there. But there is this idea of homosexuality being okay, I guess, in ancient Greece. Arguably, it's less kind of woke than what we would consider it's for less woke reasons, I guess. It's mostly because I don't like men, or excuse me, I like men because I hate women, that sort of mentality thinking. But in addition to this form of patriarchy, we also see kind of the belief in the nature of slavery. Slaves in ancient Greece are oftentimes foreigners. They are prisoners of war. So there is going to be a lot of slaves captured during conflict, and they're sold into slavery that are transported to ancient Greece, transported to the city-states of ancient Greece. And much like how patriarchy is viewed as natural, almost scientific, slavery is also seen as natural. It's only natural that we have hierarchies. It's only natural, quote unquote, that we have slaves. And this philosophical thinking about slavery is going to be something that is continuous in world history, especially in Western Europe. And this is something we'll talk about a lot when we start to talk about African slavery, when we start to talk about Europeans using African slavery. There are kind of different treatments of slaves depending on the city-state, depending on the culture. In Athens, slaves are viewed as property. They are viewed as commodities to be sold and exchanged. Whereas slaves in places like Sparta, they're kind of not owned by individuals, but owned by the state, owned by the government, owned by the oligarchy for the service of everybody. And these Spartan slaves, they're called helots, Helots. So slaves oftentimes did not have any rights. They had limited to no rights dependent on which city you are in. They could buy their freedom in some city-states. They could be treated as members of the family in some city-states. And in some city-states, punishment was viewed as acceptable and not as a violation of human rights. On top of this, there is going to also be this idea of us versus them, that foreigners to ancient Greece, they're viewed as barbarians. This is actually where the term barbarian comes from. It means people with beards. People with beards are the absolute worst. They are uncivilized. They are unable to adapt to the obviously superior Greek culture. So there is this kind of idea of us versus them emerging in city-states. There's this idea that Greek's culture is civilized and superior to everybody else. It's not necessarily based on race. That's an important thing that I'll mention throughout this class. Race is a relatively new concept. We'll talk about that birth in Unit 4, when we talk about the rise of empires, when we talk about the rise of colonies in the New World, but we'll get there later. So you see, I'm used to saying this. So you should be able to identify some key characteristics of ancient Greek city-states. Well, let's look at kind of the golden age of ancient Greece, the time when we see all this wonderful culture, when we see all this art being made. Well, the issuing of the Greek golden age, of the Athenian golden age, to be more specific, is actually going to come after a series of wars with everyone's favorite empire, Persia. So as the Persian Empire is expanding, as we talked about in our last presentation, we are going to see ancient Persia coming into territory typically occupied by Greek colonists in what is today Turkey. So as Cyrus is expanding, he's going to come into conflict with Greek colonies in Asia Minor. And initially, kind of Cyrus is okay. You know, he seems like a pretty cool dude. Darius, his successor, is also going to be viewed as pretty cool. But eventually, kind of under Xerxes, we are going to see an unpopularity between the Greek colonists and their Persian overlords. The Greek colonists have trade connections with the other Greek city-states, and they want to be a part of that world and independent, but not a part of the Persian Empire. So we are going to see a series of rebellions against the Persian rule. It's known as the Ionian Revolt. And eventually, out of kind of a shared motivation to defend these similar Greek-speaking people, the city-states of ancient Greece are going to bind together and they're going to fight against the Persians. This issues the Greco-Persian Wars. One of the more famous battles is the Battle of Thermopylae. That's where this whole 300 movie comes from. There's also the Battle of Marathon, where marathons become a thing. That's a different story. But as a result of the Greco-Persian Wars, Greece is going to win. Woohoo! We're going to see the creation of a military confederacy, kind of a loose association of independent city-states who are bounded together for shared military protection. We are going to see kind of the first form of political unification, to a degree, in Greece. They're all united for the common defense against the Persians. And this league is known as the Delian League. It's led by Athens. And these city-states, they have to pay shares, they have to pay for these common upkeep of their shared military. And Athens being the leader of this league, Athens is seeing all of this money go to them. But this money isn't necessarily just going to the military. It's going to go to Athens itself. Money's going to be funneled into Athens. And this is going to lead to a golden age in Athens. When we see the creation of a lot of pieces of art, when we see a golden age in philosophy. So typically when there's money in world history, there's stability and peace. And when there's stability and peace and money, there's a lot of art and philosophy. So those are going to be major components of what will come out of the Athenian Golden Age. And as a result, we're going to see long-lasting cultural legacies of the ancient Greeks on Western society, on European society. So let's take a look at religion. Let's take a look at art and culture in ancient Greece. Well, ancient Greek religion, as we all know, is going to directly inspire the greatest young adult novel series of all time, the Percy Jackson. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I don't care, actually. I've never read Percy Jackson. Don't cancel me. But Greek religion is notable because not only is it shared by different groups of people within Greece, but is also going to be kind of a tool to help explain philosophical concepts. The gods in ancient Greece are relatable to human concerns. They are able to screw up. They are able to mess up. They're able to screw around. Looking at you, Zeus. So gods in ancient Greece are going to be viewed as a kind of way to explain human nature. Oh, humans are greedy sometimes. Humans sometimes are good. Sometimes humans are curious with nature, stuff like that. Art is another major legacy of ancient Greece, at least to Western society, at least to the quote-unquote heritage of European places. And one thing that is notable about ancient Greek art is its insistence and focus on symmetry, on balance. And this is viewed as a scientific or rational way to depict the world. So architecture is going to be very much using engineering concepts of mathematics. We're also going to see very realistic anatomy being represented in Greek sculpture. And you can see these three examples down here of some Greek philosophers I'll talk about in a second. So symmetry and rationality in art is a major legacy of ancient Greece, something that we will see again when we discuss the Renaissance and the Islamic Golden Age, too. Another thing that's legacy of ancient Greece, legacy. What is a legacy? Anyway, another legacy of ancient Greece is epic poetry. So this is where a lot of the preservation of Greek culture comes from. And it's represented in everybody's favorite adult comedy dad, Homer. Homer, of course, is going to write or transcribe, I should say, the Iliad. He's also going to do that with the Odyssey. So works of Greek culture are going to become what we consider canon in European society. But philosophy is also going to be a major kind of legacy of ancient Greece, primarily in its stress on reason, on rationality, and something we call empiricism. Empiricism essentially is explaining a thought using evidence, using empirical evidence. So ideas of logic, of argument, of debate, they're going to come in the Western tradition through ancient Greece. And essentially, ancient Greek philosophy is asking this simple question. Why? Why are we the way we are? Why do we learn? Why do we think? Why do we have systems of government? And you can see that with these figures, these big philosophers. Socrates is introducing kind of this concept of questioning hierarchy. He's eventually going to be executed for doing that. Plato, his student, he's going to say we need to teach people how to think. He's going to be very influential in establishing kind of the academy so that elite members of Athenian society, they can learn logic. And then finally, Aristotle. Aristotle was a bugger for the bottle. That's a Monty Python reference. Aristotle is going to kind of form the ideal person, what it means to be a well-rounded individual. And the reason why I mention these philosophers is not that you need to know what they're talking about. These Mayo white people, I'm not going to say the full thing, these Mayo but white people. But the reason why they're important is that they will be majorly influential in European history, as we will discuss when we talk about not only the Renaissance, but the Middle Ages as well. And then there's my favorite Greek philosopher, Diogenes. Diogenes was a cool guy, in my opinion. He is a cynic. He very much hates all of this stuffiness of these other Greek philosophers. There's a famous story of him going to a lecture that Plato was giving, and Plato was boring, much like myself. And Plato was like, "What is man but a featherless biped? A person with two legs. We are but birds I don't know what I was going for there. Anyway, Diogenes is going to bust in and he's going to have a plucked chicken and he's going to be like, "Behold, a man." So that's a funny story. You see, we have fun in AP world. All right, let's keep going. Well, eventually city-states are going to decline in ancient Greece. Why is that? Well, there's going to be a big war. Essentially, everybody's fed up with Athens being so high and mighty. Oh, we have democracy. We have philosophy. We're taking all of your money from the Delian League. Well, there's going to be a big old war, and Athens and Sparta are going to go head to head, and it's going to have a few impacts on Greek civilization. Well, for one thing, it's going to weaken all of these city-states. I mean, Athens is literally going to burn down. There's going to be a big plague that happens in Athens. So as a result of this weakened city-states, Greece is not very stable enough to defend from outside invaders, from groups of people who are to the north of ancient Greece, a group of people called the Macedonians. So outside invaders are able to come in easily into the Greek peninsula and take things over. And that's going to start a period known as the Hellenistic Period, in which these outside invaders are not only going to invade Greece, but they're going to invade beyond Greece, and as a result, spreading Greek or Hellenistic culture. And that's going to lead to the rise of Macedonia as a kingdom in the Greek peninsula. This dude named Philip II, he is going to see the weakened city-states after the Peloponnesian War. He's going to take it over. He's eventually killed, assassinated, and his son, some guy who's not that notable, his name is Alexander, he's going to take over, and he is going to create an empire that is going to stretch all the way from Greece to India. It's a huge empire, one of the biggest in this early classical period. He's going to destroy the Greeks' most hated enemy, the Persians, and he's going to create a unified empire that is going to significantly diffuse, spread Greek culture. So Greek culture is going to expand not just in Europe, but in the Middle East as well. But Alexander was a pragmatic guy. He's going to incorporate local rules into his government. He's going to respect religious freedom. He is going to say to local leaders, as long as you respect that I'm the guy really in charge, you can still be in charge of your local areas. That's fine. Just pay taxes to me, pay homage, that sort of thing. And that's going to create stability while Alexander survives, because he's a well-respected figure. He becomes the pharaoh of Egypt at one point. He marries local princesses. However, he dies, probably of malaria. He's a big alcoholic too. And as a result of his death and not having a successor, he is going to have his kingdom break apart. And we are going to see the breakup of Alexander's empire into different Greek-like states, into different Hellenized kingdoms. So what's the impact of all of this? Well, the big thing is diffusion. But we also need to introduce another term, and that is going to be syncretism. Syncretism essentially is the blending of two distinct cultures, religions, to make a unique form of culture. So as Alexander and his successors, as they create stable empires, they are going to see the spread of Greek culture away from the geographically isolated ancient Greece, all the way as far as ancient India. And we'll talk about India more in our first unit. But we see, for an example of syncretism, a blending of Greek styles of architecture and sculpture with Indian religious themes. And you can see that in this image right here. This is an example of syncretism. It's the Buddha, who's an important figure in Buddhism, done in a Greek style. So this is what we call Hellenization, the spread or diffusion of Greek culture. Another thing that is going to happen is that we are breaking Greece's geographic isolation, and we are promoting trade routes between the East and the West. So it's in this atmosphere that we are eventually going to see things like the Silk Road. Alexander the Great's empire is not only the basis of kind of what is considered an ideal empire from Europeans, but also societies that will emerge in the Middle East, especially especially Islamic empires. And that's a major theme of what we'll talk about in Unit 1, is that Islamic empires are going to preserve Greek culture, and they are going to be the ones who save it, not Europe. So you should be able to identify some legacies of ancient Greece, and you should also be able to identify why is Alexander the Great so significant in world history, not just in the classical period, but beyond. Thank you for listening. This is the video. I'm going to go now. Bye. All right. Okay, no one watches these videos. Yeah, why not? Why not just not turn it dark? Anyway, God, I hate these sophomores. Oh, is the camera rolling? I don't hate you guys. I'm sorry. All right, bye.